Today we are discussing Waking Up by Sam Harris. I picked this title because I figured it would be a good introduction to spirituality for anyone who is more secular-minded. It was also the title of Sam Harris's podcast before it was called Making Sense, which I kind of miss, but Making Sense is quite fitting. I made this video with the hope of making sense of spirituality. Every experience you've ever had is shaped by your mind. If your mind is in a constant state of misery, no matter how good the circumstance, you won't be able to enjoy it. We use our goals as excuses to feel the present when we achieve them. The quality of our lives can be determined by how aware we are of the present moment. This is obvious to mystics and sages, but there's scientific evidence that this is in fact the case as well. There are two potential mistakes when trying to unite science and religion, either from the point of view of science viewing spirituality as merely an exaggerated way of describing mundane states of consciousness, or the more New Agey trap of idealizing altered states of consciousness and claiming that mystics predicted quantum mechanics and modern cosmology. Pseudo-spirituality versus pseudoscience. Few scientists have strong introspective practice. Most even doubt its value. Conversely, one doesn't have to know the equations of quantum mechanics to be a great contemplative. However, there are connections between scientific and spiritual wisdom, such as the self that we think of is an illusion. Positive emotions are teachable, and how we think of reality has a great impact of the way we experience reality. If you are more secular-minded, you may argue that spirituality is nothing more than a deception or even a mental illness. Sam Harris acknowledges that there's many dysfunctional things about religion. At the surface, the world's religions have drastic differences in their belief systems. And yes, the mystical experiences of sages across humanity's traditions have described their visions in the specific imagery of their tradition. However, it should be noted that the realization of unconditional love, eternal bliss, and compassion have been experienced by mystics in all traditions. See my commentary series on Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy if you would like to learn more. Practices such as meditation give us an opportunity to see what is really going on in our mind, reducing anxiety and increasing patience, compassion, bliss, and unconditional love. It's possible to experience these things while sitting and being mindful in the here and now. This is the exact opposite of our typical strategy for seeking happiness. Typically, we expect circumstances to go our way. We want our relationships to go a certain way, our night out a certain way, our career to go a certain way, even politicians and the world to go a certain way. This is a recipe for disaster for obvious reasons. It's unreasonable to expect reality to be a constant when reality is constantly changing. Is it possible to be satisfied before our desires are satisfied? I'm following you, but does this mean that I have to take up the path of renunciation and give up all my worldly possessions? Do I still get to eat bacon? I've been meditating and practicing spirituality for a few years, and yes, I still eat bacon. However, with even the most extreme ascetic examples, it's interesting to ponder how certain monks use what we consider the worst kinds of punishment. I'm talking, of course, about solitary confinement in maximum security prisons. It is more torturous to be alone with one's thoughts for weeks on end than to be in the company of murderers and rapists. Mystics, however, find total solitude to be a tool for spiritual liberation. Harris describes the contemplatives he worked with who would meditate for 12 to 18 hours a day. I can attest that when one goes into silence and meditates for weeks at a time, doing nothing else, not speaking, reading, writing, just making a moment-to-moment effort to observe the contents of consciousness, one has experiences that are generally unavailable to people who have not undertaken a similar practice. I believe that in such states of mind have a lot to say about the nature of consciousness and the possibilities of human well-being. Harris makes a distinction of Eastern and Western religion. In Western religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the human soul is seen as separate from God. The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart claimed that people should see God in everything. This is something that would seem obvious within Hindu or Buddhist thought. However, to become a Christian, one must believe Jesus turned water into wine. And the origin of the Bible, if one claims that the individual sense of self as a soul doesn't exist, is considered blasphemy. One can investigate the nature of one's mind without adhering to religious dogma. You may have heard the term mindfulness as a spiritual fad on social media. So mindful of your mindfulness. So what is mindfulness all about? It is about experiencing what is literally in front of you. Typically in our experience, we seek pleasure and avoid pain. Even when we get what we want, we seek the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, avoiding the reality that is directly in front of us. I challenge you to pause this video for just a minute without fidgeting or checking your phone. What do you notice? What is uncomfortable? Was it boring? Or did you notice the patterns around you, the rich detail of reality through each of our senses? Did you notice that there is an act of awareness observing all these things? This is what mindfulness is all about. A clear, lucid state of mind to perceive what is exactly in front of you, clear of distraction. This liberates us from anxiety, depression, as well as an improvement of memory, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. Meditation isn't about thinking more effectively about reality, but experiencing it directly. Thoughts are not the problem, but the lack of awareness that we are thinking can cause problems. While we are thinking can cause problems. The phrase empty your mind is often used in meditation. Thoughts can be seen as a distraction. However, it's important to have proper expectations. We do think a lot and we will be distracted while meditating. However, as Sam Harris points out, when you notice that you are thinking, bring your awareness back to the moment, and the fact that you notice that you're thinking is the equivalent of a mental push-up. It can get kind of tricky too when you wonder what exactly is observing the thoughts in the first place. What is behind the thoughts? So how do I cultivate mindfulness? How do you practice? Set aside 15 to 30 minutes. Insight Timer is a great app for this that I use personally. A good start is to pay attention to your breath. Paying attention to your breath will make you breathe more fully. Notice any sensations. If you notice a tree or an object, give that your full attention and absorb it. If you hear a bird chirping or the wind rustling through the trees, listen as if it were a musical composition. The same goes for feelings in your body, mood or thoughts. Anything you experience, give it your full attention. And you can do this for all of the senses and focus on a specific thing for a minute, even a few minutes, building your way up to 20 minutes or longer. What did the Buddha mean when he spoke of unsatisfactoriness or dukkha? We think that if we insulate ourselves through wealth, status, we can be happy, but this isn't the case. It should be no surprise that there's a number of celebrities with drug addictions or depression, for instance. To be alive, you have to accept that sometimes it's shitty. Typically, we chase pleasure and worldly distraction to achieve happiness. However, what if there was a more effective strategy to eliminate our suffering? What is enlightenment? Do we have to meditate until a version of ourselves with a robe manifests? If one is enlightened, can they perform mathematical feats? Could they scientifically describe the whole universe and then paint it in the morning? Harris argues that an experience of enlightenment is defined as losing the separate sense of self that is boundless. And what if we were to look at this, and if we were to look at it rationally, about human consciousness, and the whole universe. The purpose of meditation is to examine our state of mind. This helps avoid unnecessary suffering and confusion and brings in a healthier state of mind. Ideally, a spiritual master is no longer affected by their thoughts at all. Even though we may not reach an enlightened state permanently, it is still worthwhile to see through our relentlessly neurotic minds. Every state of mind we've ever experienced has arisen and passed. What meditation teaches us to do is notice these states instead of fighting or chasing after them. On the one hand, Western science is skeptical of Eastern practices or any other woo-woo. On the other hand, followers of these practices are spiritually wise but adhere to certain dogmas. Harris advocates for a rational spirituality that is somewhere in the middle. Enlightenment is when one sees things as they really are. When we see things as they are, and not as our mind or ego projects them to be, we can enter a profound state of connectedness, serenity, and well-being. We can't discuss spirituality without, of course, discussing consciousness. Investigating consciousness is the basis for spiritual life. However, it is not easy to define scientifically. The challenge consciousness raises in science is its relation to the physical world. Scientifically, we could view ourselves as a collection of atoms, molecules, synapses, etc. But this is not how we experience reality. We experience reality as consciousness, and its consciously changing content. How do we know if something is conscious? Is it the ability to speak or use facial expressions? Not necessarily. As an example, Harris uses, a friend of his went through surgery and was conscious while the surgery was performed, more than he would have liked, but he wasn't able to speak up, so he was still conscious through the surgery on his liver. There may come a time in the future where AI can overcome the uncanny valley, and it will be hard to verify if they are conscious or not. In our modern age, it is tempting to simplify consciousness as simply the result of neurons firing off in the brain. However, the problem with this is that it can be difficult to separate consciousness from its contents. Consciousness is the substance of any experience that we can have or hope for, now or in the future. It should be clear that if a person begins to suffer from intractable pain or depression, if he experiences a continuous lingering in his ears or consequences having acquired a bad reputation among his colleagues, these developments are matters of consciousness and its contents. Whatever the nature of the unconscious processes that gives rise to them. Consciousness is also what gives our moral dimension. Without consciousness, we would have no cause or wonder how we should behave towards other human beings. Nor could we care how we are treated in return. The fact that the universe is illuminated where you stand is a mystery, exceeded only by the mystery that there should be something rather than nothing in the first place. Although science may ultimately show us how to truly maximize human well-being, it will fail to dispel the fundamental mystery to being itself. That doesn't leave much scope for conventional religious beliefs, but it does offer a deep foundation for a contemplative life. Many truths about ourselves will be discovered in consciousness directly, or not discovered at all. As antithetical to everything we believe about ourselves, as this may sound, the self is an illusion. There are logical reasons to believe this, but that is something for you to experience yourself, meditation practice. The sense of being in I defines us as being, provides the basis for which we believe that we have a soul, or free will. Here's a thought experiment that challenges our sense of self as purely just the physical body. Scientists have developed a way for you to teleport to Mars. However, they must recreate you from the atom up. And it will be you in your current form will be annihilated to being you there. Is this you on Mars really you? Are we defined by what's inside our skin? What about the inside of our skulls? Are we found inside our brain? Where do we end and where do we begin? Typically we say I when referring to ourselves, as the observer of experience. The fact that we have the ability to be so subjective toward our experience is a problem that has puzzled philosophers for ages. We change in age, experience, interests over time, but a more global sense of self is maintained. To discover the illusory nature of the self requires us to look inward. Whatever its relation to the physical world, consciousness is the context in which the objects of experience appears. The sight of this book, the sound of traffic, the sensation of your back against a chair, there is nowhere else for them to appear, for their very appearance is consciousness in action, and anything that is unique to your experience of the world must appear amid the contents of consciousness. We have every reason to believe that these contents depend upon the physical structure of your brain, and you will duplicate your contents into another field of consciousness. Divide your brain, and you will segregate those contents in bizarre ways. End quote. You may think something like, this is me. This is what are you talking about? What is the self? As neuroscience points out, there is no clearly defined self in the brain. The problem here is that when trying to pinpoint consciousness, what is generating consciousness? We are using consciousness to try and pinpoint consciousness. To do this in a more effective way requires a different practice altogether. Meditation is one of the most effective tools to see reality clearly without the distortion of the mind. Not to mention, it is also beneficial to one's mental health as well. The goal of meditation is to see through the bullshit of our ego and our minds, and to see reality as it is directly, especially today with all of the distractions around us, what Buddhists call the monkey mind. Harris examines gurus for a bit as well. If we were to find someone to teach us guitar lessons and they asked us to shave our heads and take up a vow of celibacy, we would find that quite weird. However, in spirituality, this is quite common, especially in more ascetic forms. For finding a spiritual teacher, a rule of thumb is if the guru is saying that he must fuck your wife to become more enlightened, he's probably full of shit. This isn't to say that there aren't spiritual masters who have something really valuable to share. Near-death experiences are a fascinating phenomenon because they give us a glimpse of what's on the other side after we parted ways from our physical bodies. Someone is, quote, physically dead, but still has an experience of floating out of their body and going to heavenly realms. And in fact, when DMT experiences are compared to NDEs, they are remarkably similar. The question then arises if these experiences are in fact consciousness leaving the body, going to a non-physical realm, or if this is just the brain coping with dying. Harris argues that near-death experiences could be occurring because the brain is secreting DMT during the NDE. However, I won't strawman the position of Harris as purely materialism. Harris is agnostic as to the direct correlation between consciousness and physical reality, and concludes that we can have a lot of value in taking up spiritual practice in our lives. However, I'll end with a quote by Jeffrey Long, MD, recognized world expert on NDEs. Multiple lines of evidence point to the conclusion that near-death experiences are medically inexplicable and cannot be explained by known physical brain function. Many of the preceding lines of evidence would be remarkable if they were reported by a group of individuals during conscious experience. However, NDEers are generally unconscious or clinically dead at the time of their experience in ways that they shouldn't have any lucid, organized memories from their time of unconsciousness. You can bet your ass I'll provide the citation for that in the description. Now you can duke it out and fight all you want in the comments section. The last thing I'll leave you with, especially if you are more secular-minded, is that a more secular mindfulness practice is a good place to start. I know that's how I started in this path. It's still valuable to have a mentor and a tradition like Hinduism or Buddhism to work with. And it's easy for us to say, well, if we have science and iPhones, why do we need to hear all this boring religious dogma? Yes, religion can be dogmatic and dysfunctional and restrictive. There's no doubt about that. However, there's still a lot of insights into the nature of humanity, how to reduce suffering, and even our role in the cosmos. There's a potential for a lot of wisdom to be lost with strictly viewing things in secular terms. Rationality has its place for sure. And there's even places where I think more rationality should be applied in society. This isn't necessarily to debunk rationality or secular ways of looking at things. But mindfulness is only the beginning. And there is a lot of territory to be discovered as well on the inward journey. That concludes today's video. I am Parker Tebow of Focus Shift Media. Have a phenomenal week.